The rain had turned the fields into rivers of mud. American infantry moved through hedgerows under a sky that never stopped screaming. Artillery, machine gun fire, and the hiss of incoming mortars. Among them was a private, crawling forward through shattered wheat, his steel helmet glinting faintly under the gray light. A shell burst nearby. Shrapnel ripped across the earth like angry sparks. Something struck his head with a sharp metallic clang. He froze, heart pounding, then blinked, still alive. The fragment had ricocheted off the curve of his helmet, leaving only a dent. He reached up, felt the groove, and silently kept moving. All around him, others did the same, their helmets black and battered and streaked with mud. Not one man removed it, not even in sleep. They had learned something simple and final. The difference between life and death could be a thin sheet of steel. And the world that once mocked it would soon understand why none of them ever took it off. By 1939, the world was on fire again. Europe's fields and cities echoed with the thunder of mechanized war. Panzers rolling through Poland, Stukas diving from the sky, and men scrambling for cover that no longer existed. Machine guns cut down lines of soldiers who wore helmets designed for the last war. Not this one. The lessons of the trenches had faded into history, replaced by speed, armor, and shock. The helmets soldiers wore at the outbreak of World War II still carried the ghosts of 1918. The British marched with their flat-rimmed Brodie helmets, thin steel dishes that offered little side protection. The French relied on the ornate Adrian, elegant in appearance, but fragile under modern fire. The Germans, meanwhile, had refined their distinctive Stahlhelm, forged from manganese steel, deep-sided and heavy, offering formidable coverage for head and neck. It was more than protection. It was a symbol of fear, the silhouette of Blitzkrieg. Across the Atlantic, the United States Army faced a problem of its own. Having stood mostly idle through the interwar years, the U.S. military still issued the M1917 helmet, an American copy of the British Brodie, to its soldiers. Thin, shallow, and outdated, it was a relic of trench warfare. It deflected shrapnel falling from above, but left the sides of the head and face dangerously exposed. When the first waves of modernization swept across Europe, American military planners took notice. Reports from the Spanish Civil War, a brutal testing ground for new weapons, revealed a grim truth. Artillery fragments and ricochets were now the greatest killers on the battlefield. A helmet that could not protect from lateral or low-trajectory fragments was no longer acceptable. In 1939, as Hitler invaded Poland and the world edged toward chaos, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department began to rethink what a soldier's helmet should be. It could no longer be a ceremonial plate of steel. It had to become a functional tool, as critical as a rifle or a pair of boots. It needed to balance protection, comfort, and endurance. But in the late 1930s, few could agree on what that looked like. Engineers debated shapes and materials. Some suggested modifying the old Brodie. Others proposed copying the German design, but political optics made that impossible. The new American helmet had to be distinctly American, practical, efficient, and mass-producible. The project gained momentum at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where engineers and ordnance officers experimented with new forms. The challenge was enormous. The helmet needed to be light enough to wear for days on end, yet strong enough to survive fragments traveling at over 800 feet per second. It needed to fit thousands of head sizes, and it had to be built from materials that could be produced by a nation soon to enter full-scale war. Meanwhile, across the oceans, the world continued to crumble. German tanks roared across France. The Luftwaffe bombed London night after night. Japan swept through China, carving an empire through fire and terror. American factories still produced cars and radios, but soon they would forge steel for something far deadlier. When Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, the U.S. prepared for a new kind of war. Millions of young men would soon be wearing uniforms again, and they needed something better to protect their heads. At that moment, the M1917 helmet was not just obsolete. It was a liability. Soldiers in early training complained it was uncomfortable, unbalanced, and nearly useless against side fragments. The War Department demanded a replacement, and quickly. What followed would become one of the most significant, yet often overlooked, engineering revolutions of the 20th century. A new helmet was designed, tested, and produced in the span of months. It would not only shield a generation of soldiers, but redefine how the world saw the American fighting man. The men who first mocked at the enemy, the Allies, even the soldiers themselves, would one day realize they were witnessing the birth of an icon. Because in Detroit and Pittsburgh, in factories that once built radiators and car fenders, America was about to forge its answer, a helmet not just of steel, but a spirit. And it would be called the M1. In 1940, as the United States edged closer to war, the Ordnance Department and the Infantry Board began a concentrated search for a helmet that could meet the brutal demands of modern combat. The task was urgent. Millions of new recruits were entering training camps across the nation, and the old M1917 helmet no longer inspired confidence. The solution began quietly in Detroit, in a factory better known for automobile radiators than for weapons, McCord Radiator and Manufacturing Company. The firm was approached to experiment with a new design, one that combined protection, comfort, and adaptability. Alongside McCord, the Schluter Manufacturing Company in St. Louis would later join the massive production effort. Designers studied the failures of previous helmets. The British Brodie was too shallow. The German Stahlhelm offered great protection, but was heavy and difficult to produce in large numbers. What the U.S. needed was something balanced, deep enough to protect the sides and back of the head, but light enough for the endless marches and battles ahead. The breakthrough came with the idea of a two-piece design, a concept that had never been applied on this scale. Instead of a single heavy steel shell, the new helmet would consist of a steel outer shell and a detachable inner liner, made from compressed fiber and resin. The liner would allow soldiers to adjust the fit, replace parts, and even remove it when off duty. It was both practical and revolutionary. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, early prototypes were tested in late 1940. The design evolved rapidly, incorporating lessons from ballistic experiments and soldier feedback. The chosen material for the steel shell was Hadfield manganese steel, an alloy renowned for its ability to resist deformation and absorb shock. The alloy's flexibility and strength made it perfect for stopping shrapnel without cracking or splitting. The distinctive pot-shaped, round, smooth, and with a sloping brim was a result of both science and necessity. Its geometry helped deflect fragments and even small-caliber bullets glancing off its surface. The deeper dome protected the ears, neck, and temples, the areas most often wounded in combat. When the final design, officially designated helmet, Steel M1, was approved in June 1941, it marked a quiet but profound transformation in U.S. military equipment. Production began almost immediately. McCord's Detroit factory converted its entire operation to helmet manufacturing, while Schluter took up production to meet the exploding demand. By December 1941, the month of Pearl Harbor, the M1 helmet was already being issued to new soldiers. Within a year, millions had been produced, and by war's end, over 22 million units would roll off assembly lines, one for nearly every man who served. Yet its genius was not only in its protection. The M1 was a soldier's tool. Its sturdy shell could serve as a wash basin, a seat, a pot for boiling coffee, or a makeshift shovel in muddy foxholes. Its liner, painted olive drab or covered in netting, became a canvas for individuality, names, units, and even small charms scrawled on its surface. When American troops arrived in North Africa in 1942, the M1 was still new to the world. British observers were puzzled by its shape. German intelligence dismissed it as ungainly. Japanese reports mocked its bulky, uneven contour. Yet in the field, its value became immediately clear. Soldiers who took shrapnel to the head and lived began writing home about the helmet that had saved their lives. Each dent told a story. The M1 was also engineered for mass efficiency. Its parts could be replaced, its liner reused, and its materials sourced domestically. The liner itself evolved. Early versions made of fiber were soon replaced with sturdier resin-impregnated cloth, developed by the Hawley Products Company and later improved by Westinghouse and Inland Manufacturing. Even the chin strap, a seemingly small feature, carried lessons learned from combat. Early versions could be torn loose to prevent neck injuries if the helmet caught on debris, an innovation that saved countless lives during explosions and tank warfare. By mid-1943, the M1 helmet had become one of the most recognized features of the American soldier's silhouette. Whether in the deserts of Tunisia, the jungles of Guadalcanal, or the icy forests of Bastogne, it appeared in every photograph, every newsreel, every letter home. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't symbolize aggression or dominance. It represented endurance. And while enemy troops mocked its shape, they could not ignore its resilience. The M1 did more than protect the head. It gave soldiers confidence. It allowed them to stand, to fight, and to look forward under fire. By the time American troops landed in Normandy, the M1 helmet was no longer just equipment. It was identity. The curve of its brim, the dent of its crown, the sound it made when struck, these became part of the rhythm of war itself. And soon, the world would see that what began as an industrial experiment had evolved into one of the most enduring symbols of the 20th century battlefield. By 1944, the M1 helmet had become more than a piece of standard issue. It was a miniature fortress of American engineering. Every curve, rivet, and contour had a purpose. What looked ordinary to the untrained was, in truth, the product of 1,000 battlefield lessons written in steel. Unlike earlier helmets designed only to stop falling shrapnel, the M1 was shaped to deflect, not absorb, impact. Its rounded dome and sloped brim guided fragments away from the skull, reducing the force of impact by redirecting it. Engineers calculated angles so precisely that even a small adjustment in curvature meant the difference between a wound and survival. In ballistic testing, fragments traveling at speeds over 800 feet per second could be turned aside by the helmet's hardened Hadfield manganese alloy. It was indestructible. No helmet ever was. But it could stop or deflect nearly 3/4 of lethal shrapnel in real-world combat scenarios. For the first time, a soldier's chances in an artillery barrage were measurably improved by what sat on his head. That difference became clear on the battlefield. During the invasion of Sicily in 1943, field surgeons reported a sharp decline in fatal head injuries among American troops compared to earlier campaigns. In the Pacific, Marines fighting on Tarawa and Saipan wrote in after-action reports that the helmet saved more lives than any single piece of equipment except the rifle. The M1's two-piece construction was equally revolutionary. The inner liner, fitted with webbing straps and an adjustable suspension, distributed weight evenly and reduced fatigue. Soldiers could wear for days without the bruising discomfort that plagued earlier designs. The outer shell could be removed for cleaning, repair, or use as a utility tool. And use it they did. In the muddy foxholes of Italy, soldiers boiled coffee and shaved using water collected in their helmets. On Pacific Islands, where supplies were scarce, the same helmets were used to dig trenches, carry food, and even as makeshift cooking pots. Infantrymen washed socks in them, collected rainwater, and used them as pillows during exhausted moments between shellings. Each of these improvised uses may seem trivial, but they represented the essence of American military design philosophy, versatility. The M1 was not just armor, it was a multi-purpose field companion. Its olive drab surface was carefully engineered too. The roughened texture, applied with cork granules, broke up light reflection, a primitive but effective camouflage against the sun's glare and enemy spotters. Many soldiers customized their helmets further by attaching netting, burlap, or foliage, transforming them into living camouflage suited for hedgerow or jungle. Then came another overlooked innovation, the chin strap and bales. The M1's fixed bales and webbing chin strap were designed to hold firm during movement, but give way under violent impact. This subtle flexibility prevented neck injuries common with helmets that caught on debris or were jolted by explosions. In time, the bales themselves evolved, from fragile fixed loops to movable ones, improving resilience without sacrificing comfort. Statistical reports from Army Ground Forces medical studies between 1943 and 1945 revealed that the M1 reduced serious head trauma by up to 15 to 20% compared to early war casualty ratios. These figures may sound small, but on the scale of millions of men, it meant thousands of lives spared. There was also a psychological effect. Troops trusted the M1. Knowing that their helmet could withstand the shrapnel that once decimated entire trenches gave soldiers a sense of protection that no doctrine or speech could deliver. A confident man fought longer, steadier, harder. The helmet standardization also represented America's industrial might. While Europe's armies struggled with production shortages, the United States produced millions of identical M1 shells with minimal variation. This meant that spare parts, liners, and chin straps were interchangeable between units from Normandy to Iwo Jima. A soldier could lose his helmet in France and pick up another in Belgium, and it would fit, function, and feel exactly the same. Every unit of the M1 was proof of industrial efficiency. Each helmet underwent ballistic testing, heat treatment, and painting before shipment. Every piece was serialized, inspected, and approved. The process was mechanical, but the outcome was profoundly human. A tool that made survival more probable. Even in the air and at sea, the M1 adapted. Pilots and paratroopers received modified versions with special liners, reinforced webbing, or custom straps for airborne jumps. Naval personnel used variations treated with corrosion-resistant coatings to withstand salt exposure. The M1 became a foundation for specialized branches of service, each version tailored but unmistakably American. To the enemy, it was a curious shape. To the men who wore it, it was security in chaos, a constant presence through rain, mud, and blood. It rattled when bullets struck nearby, rang like a bell under fire, and yet remained on the head, steady, reliable, unflinching. And as the war intensified, its symbolic and human dimensions deepened, transforming from mere protection into something far greater. Every soldier's helmet told a story. Beneath the olive drab paint, under the dents and the scratches, it carried the memory of the man who wore it, where he fought, how he survived, and what he endured. The M1 helmet was more than a shell of steel. It became a personal artifact of identity, luck, and spirit. In the foxholes of Europe, soldiers often joked that their helmets had personalities. Some named them. Others etched initials or girlfriends' names on the inside rim. On long marches, the rhythmic clink of steel against steel became a kind of anthem, a sound that united divisions and echoed across continents. It was a symbol of belonging. The helmet was a soldier's last piece of home and his first line of defense. When sleep came, shallow, nervous, and brief, many kept their helmets on, even under blankets or inside dugouts, not because of orders, but instinct. In Normandy, during endless nights of shelling, men learned that taking it off, even for a moment, could mean never waking again. Psychologically, the M1 served as a constant anchor. It provided a fragile sense of control in an uncontrollable world. When bullets cracked the air or artillery thundered from unseen hills, soldiers instinctively pulled their chins down into the rim, as if hiding inside it. The cold touch of steel against skin reminded them they were still alive. Field medics often remark how soldiers clung to their helmets even when gravely wounded, refusing to let go, as though it were a talisman. In some cases, men were buried with them, the dented metal resting like a guardian over what was left behind. This emotional connection baffled many observers. To outsiders, it was just equipment. To the men who fought from Tunisia to Okinawa, it was the one thing that shared every moment of fear and endurance. The M1 also revealed much about American psychology in war. Its shape, simple and functional, mirrored the nation's character, practical, adaptable, and unpretentious. Soldiers decorated them with cards, cigarettes, playing dice, and bits of camouflage. They weren't symbols of power. They were symbols of survival. Even the smallest ritual mattered. Some men believed painting their helmets invited bad luck. Others scrawled Bible verses inside the liner. These acts, though small, were attempts to create meaning amid chaos, to humanize an industrial war. From the enemy's perspective, the M1 was both puzzling and telling. German troops, particularly during early encounters in North African Italy, mocked its bulbous shape, calling it the salad schussel, the salad bowl. The Japanese referred to it as the bucket, joking that Americans wore cooking pots into battle. But as the war dragged on, enemy medics and intelligence officers began to note the M1's performance with grudging respect. Captured German reports from 1943 described the American helmet's superior lateral protection compared to the British type. Japanese officers, after examining recovered U.S. equipment on Guadalcanal, noted that the helmet deflects shrapnel more effectively than our Type 90. behind enemy lines. The laughter faded as soldiers witnessed how often Americans survived head wounds that would have been fatal to others. There was also a psychological warfare element at play. The silhouette of the M1, broad, low, and forward-leaning, became instantly recognizable across the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. To Axis troops, it became synonymous with the relentless advance of American forces. The shape that once drew ridicule came to inspire dread. Photographs captured the transformation. Rows of U.S. soldiers crouched behind hedgerows, the rims of their helmets glistening in the damp Normandy light. Marines silhouetted against volcanic ash on Iwo Jima, paratroopers with netted brims before D-Day. To civilians and journalists, this image, helmet low, eyes forward, defined the American fighting man. Even after the guns fell silent, veterans rarely spoke of the helmet as a mere object. They spoke of it as a companion. Many kept theirs after returning home, hanging it in garages, attics, or on mantles. Decades later, when sons and grandsons asked about the war, the helmet was often the first thing they reached for. The M1 became a relic of endurance, a piece of history carried not in museums, but in family homes. The dent and rust spoke more truth than medals or speeches. By the time World War II neared its climax, the world perception of the M1 had shifted entirely. What began as an awkward curiosity had become the most iconic combat helmet of the 20th century, an image of perseverance under fire. And on the battlefields of Normandy, the Ardennes, and Okinawa, that image was about to be tested beyond imagination. The first true test of the M1 helmet came not in the laboratories of Aberdeen or the foundries of Detroit, but on the beaches of Normandy. June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord. Dawn broke over the English Channel, veiled in mist and fear. As landing craft churned to the gray waves, American soldiers crouched shoulder to shoulder, their rifles between their knees, helmets low against the spray. The sea roared with gunfire long before the ramps dropped. For many of these men, the M1 was the only thing between their skulls and the shrapnel slicing through the air. German artillery, mortars, and machine guns tore through the surf with brutal precision. Shards of steel struck like hail. Medics on Omaha and Utah beaches would later report that many helmets were found dented, punctured, and twisted, yet the men beneath them survived. Survival, however, was never guaranteed. Some shells struck clean through, others ricocheted at deadly angles. But statistically, the M1 saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives that morning alone. Soldiers who had trained with the M1917 in the States often said later that without the new design, the casualties on D-Day would have been even higher. The helmet's unique curvature and tough Hatfield steel made it a quiet miracle in the storm. The sloped sides deflected fragments downward, sparing faces and necks. Some helmets bore holes where bullets had grazed the surface and veered off instead of penetrating, a physics lesson written in blood and sand. The U.S. Army Medical Department's field studies from Normandy and subsequent campaigns recorded a remarkable pattern. When compared with early war operations, head wounds per thousand casualties dropped significantly, not because artillery had grown weaker, but because protection had grown smarter. As American troops pushed inland to the Bocage country in Normandy, the M1 endured the relentless grind of attrition warfare. Its matte finish resisted glare from the sun that might reveal a sniper's target. Its liner absorbed sweat and impact, preventing concussions from near misses. Soldiers even discovered that the steel shell, when inverted, could be used to collect rainwater or cook a meal over a small fire, acts of quiet defiance in a landscape of ruin. By autumn of 1944, as Allied forces reached the Siegfried Line, the M1 had already become a battlefield legend. Correspondents like Ernie Pyle described soldiers sitting on their helmets in the mud, sleeping in them, eating from them, as if it were a living extension of themselves. But the M1's reputation would be cemented not in Normandy, but in the freezing woods of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow fell silently over foxholes dug into Belgian soil. Surrounded, low on supplies, and under constant bombardment, the men of the 101st Airborne Division huddled beneath their M1 helmets, which now served not only as armor, but as shields against frost and fear. One paratrooper recalled, "When the shells came in, the whole earth shook. You press your head into that helmet, like it was part of your skull. You didn't take it off. You didn't even think about it. Medical officers later confirmed dozens of cases where shell fragments struck helmets, deforming them completely, yet leaving the wearer alive with minor concussions or scalp wounds. The M1's manganese steel had performed far beyond its design expectations. Even more astonishing was its resilience in the Pacific Theater, where the nature of warfare was entirely different. There, the M1 faced intense heat, tropical humidity, and sudden, violent combat in jungles and caves. On islands like Saipan and Iwo Jima, the helmet's versatility again proved invaluable. Marines used them to carry sand, scoop water, or as makeshift entrenching tools when equipment failed. Enemy snipers often aimed for the head, a target they assumed unprotected. But the slope contour of the M1 made glancing hits common. Reports from Marine Corps' Pacific Warfare Board recorded cases of .30 caliber bullets deflecting off helmets at oblique angles, saving the wearer's life. By war's final year, the M1 had proven itself in nearly every environment imaginable: snow, desert, jungle, and city. Soldiers trusted it the way sailors trusted their ships. They didn't remove it for photographs, for rest, or for prayer. It was both armor and identity. The sound of shrapnel striking an M1 became as recognizable as the whistle of incoming fire, a sharp metallic note followed by a moment of stunned silence and then breath. The realization of survival. This sound, that ringing note of impact and deflection, came to symbolize the endurance of the American soldier. But the deeper transformation was yet to come. The helmet would soon become more than protection. It would become faith, an unspoken pact between man and machine, between mortality and steel. As the war dragged into its final brutal year, the M1 helmet ceased to be just a piece of issued gear. It became part of the soldier's very being, an inseparable extension of his body and his will to survive. By 1945, this was evident in every photograph, every newsreel, every weary face staring from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. Helmets scarred by shrapnel, edges bent and scorched, some painted with unit insignia, others smeared with mud and ash. Yet every man wore his, always. Why none took it off was not just superstition. It was survival logic, deeply ingrained through experience. At first, the rules were simple. You kept it on because the next shell could fall anywhere. But as the war deepened, it became something more than fear. It became ritual. Soldiers felt naked without it. Removing it was like inviting fate. In interviews and memoirs, veterans spoke of sleeping in their helmets, shaving with them on the ground beside them, eating from them like bowls. Some described how, after months of shelling, the sound of steel became comforting. The soft tap of rain on metal, the clink as they passed through barbed wire. It was a sound of continuity in a world that had lost all rhythm. For many, the helmet's weight, roughly 3 pounds of steel and liner, became a reassuring burden. It pressed down on the head like a hand of protection. A soldier could feel its presence with every step, a physical reminder that something stood between him and death. Even when wounded, men often refused to let it go. Medics in both the European and Pacific theaters recounted countless scenes of soldiers gripping their helmets in unconscious reflex, fingers clenched around the rim as they were carried from the line. One medic at Bastogne wrote, "You can tell who's still aware. They're holding their helmet. The dead ones always let go." But there was another, quieter reason why no one took it off. The helmet had become a symbol of equality. Officers and enlisted men alike wore the same steel pot. In the mud and chaos of battle, rank mattered less than survival. The M1 stripped away hierarchy. Its plainness unified men who otherwise came from every corner of America: farmers, factory workers, teachers, clerks. It was the great equalizer. When replacements arrived at the front, veterans would often glance first at their helmets. A shiny, unscuffed surface marked a newcomer, someone who hadn't yet seen fire. Within days, the sheen would fade, replaced by scratches and burns as the helmet and the man were baptized by war. In this way, the M1 carried identity, but also history. Soldiers swapped them, borrowed them, sometimes kept the helmets of fallen friends. To wear a comrade's helmet was to carry a piece of him forward, a silent act of remembrance that needed no ceremony. Even the enemy came to recognize its meaning. Captured German troops in Normandy and the Ardennes often spoke of the Americans with the low helmets, describing them as relentless and hard to kill. Japanese survivors on Iwo Jima later admitted that they learned to recognize the distinct shape of the M1 bobbing forward through smoke and feared it. War correspondents began to notice it too. The American helmet was now as iconic as the rifle it accompanied. Photographers like Robert Capa and Joe Rosenthal immortalized its silhouette. Bowed heads under steel shells, men moving forward through impossible conditions. The helmet became the visual shorthand for endurance. Back home, newspapers printed images of soldiers resting behind barricades, helmets tipped forward over weary eyes. Families kept those photographs, knowing that beneath each one, the man's survival might depend on that simple curve of steel. And when the war finally began to end, when victory parades filled the streets and soldiers returned home, many still refused to part with it. Some wore their helmets during the voyage back across the Atlantic, as if afraid that peace itself might shatter. Others brought them home as keepsakes, tucked away in attics and closets. Decades later, when those veterans told their stories, they often began not with battle or victory, but with the sound, the ringing of shrapnel on steel, the proof of life in a moment of chaos. To them, the M1 was more than a helmet. It was a promise, and that is why none took it off. Not because of orders or superstition, but because beneath that steel they had learned something sacred. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the endurance of it under fire, beneath a thin, dented shell. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world emerged from the ruins of the most devastating conflict in human history. More than 16 million Americans had served, and nearly every one of them had worn the M1 helmet. What began as an overlooked piece of steel had become an enduring symbol of victory and survival. In the immediate aftermath, the U.S. Army took note of how the M1 had performed across every front. Reports from field commanders and ordnance officers told the same story. The helmet had saved lives, thousands of them. The statistics were never absolute, but battlefield surgeons confirmed what soldiers already knew. Fragments that would have pierced skulls were often deflected. The helmet didn't make a man invincible, but it gave him a fighting chance in a war that offered so few. And so, while tanks were upgraded, rifles replaced, and uniforms redesigned, the M1 remained. The Army decided not to abandon it. It had proven itself in Europe's hedgerows, in the sands of North Africa, and on the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. In a war where technology changed faster than men could adapt, the M1 stood as a rare constant. It became the face of American power, not in parades or ceremonies, but in memory. The simple curve of its shell appeared on victory posters, war bond ads, and the covers of Life and Time magazine. When Americans thought of their soldiers, they pictured that helmet first. But its legacy extended far beyond the war's end. In Korea, the bitter winds of the Chosin Reservoir whipped across the same steel shells that had once faced the Ardennes. In Vietnam, decades later, M1 helmets were still being worn by a new generation, now with camouflage covers and hand-painted mottos. The design was that enduring. It outlived the M1 Garand, the Sherman tank, and even many of the generals who once commanded its wearers. Yet perhaps its greatest legacy was not technological, but psychological. For soldiers, it came to represent a bond that transcended time. Veterans would later speak of the helmet as a silent witness, a reminder of what it meant to stand together under fire. Some couldn't bring themselves to part with it. Families found them years later, wrapped in newspaper, tucked in closets or attics, still faintly smelling of oil and earth. Inside, many were names, scratched into the liner or rim, the handwriting of a young man who once believed he might never come home. In museums today, those helmets bear the scars of war more truthfully than any photograph. Dents, punctures, burn marks. Each tells a story where a soldier stood what he faced and how narrowly he survived. But the legacy was not just personal, it was strategic. Allied armies studied the M1 closely. France adopted it during the post-war years. So did several NATO nations. Even Soviet designers took note of its balanced weight and contour when revising their own steel helmets. Its influence shaped global military design for half a century. And while the world moved on to composite materials, Kevlar, and advanced ballistics, the principle behind the M1 never changed. that a soldier's greatest weapon is not his rifle, but his ability to endure. For the Americans who had worn it across continents and oceans, the helmet was more than equipment. It was companion through terror and triumph. The sound of rain on its steel is familiar as a heartbeat. When the war ended, they took it off for the last time, but never forgot what it meant. The world that once mocked it now understood, and the symbol of endurance it created would echo through every war that followed. By the late 1940s, the M1 helmet had become more than a relic of the war. It was a cultural monument. It represented the American soldier, the citizen warrior who crossed oceans to fight tyranny and came home changed forever. Hollywood immortalized it. Films like the story of G.I. Joe, 1945, and Battleground, 1949, showed men trudging through mud, helmets low over their eyes, faces streaked with exhaustion. In each frame, that simple curve of steel captured something no dialogue could, the fatigue, courage, and quiet unity of a generation that had seen impossible and survived it. Back in small towns across the United States, families displayed those helmets on mantels and in attics. For widows and parents, it became a sacred keepsake, the one object that seemed to still carry their son's presence. The dents and scratches weren't flaws. They were proof that he had been there, under fire, and that he had mattered. Historians who studied post-war psychology found that the M1 helmet became one of the strongest emotional anchors for returning veterans. In interviews conducted by the Veterans Administration, men often recalled the sound of metal ringing as one of their most vivid memories. It wasn't trauma, it was recognition. The sound meant survival. For those who had served, it became a kind of brotherhood, invisible but lasting. Two men meeting decades later could spot an M1 in a display case and share a silent understanding. No words needed. That helmet had seen what they had seen. Even the Army recognized its symbolic power. During the Cold War, when American troops stood watch in Berlin, Korea, or Vietnam, their silhouettes still carried that same steel dome. Photographs from the Korean War looked hauntingly familiar. Snow-covered hills, grim young faces beneath helmets that might have been worn by their fathers. The continuity was unbroken. From Omaha Beach to Key Sand, the M1 became a thread connecting generations of soldiers, a reminder that while technology advanced, the experience of war remained brutally human. But the helmet's legacy wasn't purely American. Across Europe and Asia, countless civilians remembered the sight of U.S. troops, helmets catching the light as they entered liberated towns. To them, that shape meant freedom. In France, children painted their toys with makeshift M1S. In the Philippines, farmers kept American helmets they'd found in the jungle as good luck charms. Even among former enemies, the M1 commanded respect. German officers studying Allied after-action reports often noted the discipline of American infantry. Their silhouettes low in uniform, heads covered even under heavy fire. The Japanese, who had once ridiculed the tin pots of U.S. soldiers, learned on Pacific battlefields how deadly those same men could be when the steel helmets moved steadily forward, never hesitating, never breaking. By the 1980s, the M1 had been phased out of active service, replaced by the Kevlar PSGD helmet, lighter, stronger, and modern. Yet even then, it refused to disappear. Collectors, historians, and veterans preserved it with reverence. It remained in use by ceremonial guards, paratrooper units, and reserve forces around the world. Its image continued to define American remembrance, etched on memorials, engraved on gravestones, and printed in history books. The helmet that once clanged under shrapnel and rain now rested in silence, not as an artifact, but as a witness. In the end, the M1 helmet did something no designer in 1941 could have imagined. It captured not just the body, but the spirit of the men who wore it. It became a symbol of unity, endurance, and humility, of men who never called themselves heroes, yet carried the weight of history on their heads. For the generation that fought World War II, that steel shell was the one thing that had truly protected them, not just from bullets, but from forgetting who they were. And when they passed it on to their sons, it carried more than memory. It carried a message. That courage, once worn, never fades. Underneath every dented M1 helmet was a man who had seen the worst the world could offer and somehow kept moving forward. They weren't knights in shining armor. Their helmets were dull, scarred, and stained with rain, mud, and blood. But that imperfection was the truth of war. Protection didn't come from perfection, but from endurance. The M1 helmet became a quiet metaphor for that endurance. It shielded not only the skull, but the fragile courage inside it. In the frozen forests of Belgium, in the jungles of Pacific, in the ruined cities of Europe, it was the one piece of armor that asked nothing of its wearer, only that he believed it might make a difference. And it did. When historians write of World War II, they speak of tanks, aircraft, and generals, the grand machinery of victory. But ask any man who was there what he remembers most, and it won't be the weapons. It will be the sound. Rain tapping on metal, shrapnel striking and sliding away, the heartbeat echoing inside that small dome of steel. That sound was life continuing. Long after the uniforms rotted, long after rifles rusted and medals lost their shine, the M1 helmet endured. In museums, in family attics, and the collective memory of a world that learned what it cost to stay alive. Because in the end, it wasn't just a helmet. It was a promise that no matter how dark the battlefield, there would always be men who stood up, bowed their heads beneath a simple piece of steel, and kept moving forward. That's why they never took it off. Not in war. Not in memory. Not ever.